Hey y'all, welcome to another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we are going through Isaiah 23 through 27. Tomorrow we're going to go through 2 Kings chapter 18 verses 1 through 8 and 2 Chronicles chapter 29 through 31. And why don't we just throw another psalm in there as well? Let's throw in Psalm 48 for good measure. How about that? Sounds good? Alright, well let's get to it. Chapter 23. A pronouncement against Tyre. You look at this picture, probably like, what has this got to do with Tyre? Well, we'll get to it. Tyre was actually the southernmost major city in Phoenicia. Now, it was a very wealthy city due to its development and control of the sea trade. It was also an island city. How cool is that? Its major port was easily protected since it was an island. So, Tyre had established a trading colony on Tarshish. Well, Tarshish was thought to be in what is modern-day Spain today. So the ships of Tarshish were particularly impressive since they traveled so far between Tyre and Iberia. The destruction of Tyre prophetically described in this pronouncement is kind of difficult to pin down from the description that's made. The pronouncement may look forward to Nebuchadnezzar's attack on Tyre, which included a 13-month siege on the city. And this happened around the 6th century. It could also refer to the final destruction of Tyre by Alexander the Great in 322 BC. Now, Cyprus was a large island about 75 miles west of Tyre and would have been the last port of call before reaching Tyre. Now, personally, I think it's probably referring more towards the Nebuchadnezzar's attack, because later on we see about how there's this restoration that happens to Tyre before we know what happened with Alexander the Great when Alexander the Great pretty much destroyed it in 332. So I'm thinking it was the first one. But who knows? What do you think? You think it was the first one that I mentioned or the second one? Now, Egypt's going to be upset about this either way because it was a very important trading partner with Egypt. After it was destroyed, though, its inhabitants are said to have fled to Tarshish, which was in Spain. I found that kind of interesting. The pronouncement against Tyre ends with a note about its restoration. Like I said before, it also suggests that the city will turn to the Lord. So I wonder if they did between that time period. I wonder if they did turn to the Lord for real. I'm going to have to do some history, dig into that. Maybe we'll read about it later. Who knows? So next we're going to get to chapter 24, and this is about the earth being judged. And while chapters 13 through 23 focused on the judgment of particular nations, this chapter 24 all the way through 27 is going to focus more on the earth as a whole, and the object of God's punishment as the object of God's punishment. So keep in mind the earth is the object of God's punishment from here to 27. It starts out with a really long list of opposites, which is a pretty interesting way of saying that all human inhabitants of the earth will be judged without regard for social standing. Did you catch that? Without regard to social standing. Nobody's going to be immune to this. I did find it interesting that in verse 13 of chapter 24, a harvested olive tree, here it talks about olive tree and grapes again. It says, "For this is how it will be on earth among the nations, like a harvested olive tree, like a gleaning after a grape harvest." Now, this is important because an olive tree or a grapevine after a harvest only has a few olives or grapes left. So, the cities of the nations will have just a few people left when God's judgment falls on them. He's not going to wipe them out completely, but there's only going to be a few left. That's about it. We get to 25, chapter 25. This is a salvation and judgment. So it's two things. It's salvation and judgment. Judgment could be good and judgment could be bad. It depends on whether or not you use good or bad, I guess. So the prophet Isaiah here is actually speaking in the first person, and he praises God for his plan, and that includes both the salvation and the judgment parts of this. And that was a pretty interesting read there. Now, chapter 26, we get to it. The Song of Judah. So on that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. Salvation is established as walls and ramparts. Now, the strong city here, it contrasts with the city of chaos that we've read about. That came up in chapter 24. We didn't talk about it, but you read about it. That city represents human evil, and it has walls that crumble. But the city here, the city's strength is its walls and its ramparts, and that is defined by salvation. So this is kind of a contrast there of that. Trust in verses 3 and 4. Trust is the defining trait of those who depend on God. The image of the everlasting rock points to God's persistent protection of his people. And I'll put Isaiah 26:4 here on the screen for you. And then, of course, God's people are vindicated. I found it interesting. Verse 7, the path of the righteous is level. You clear a straight path for the righteous. This image of the path is drawn from wisdom literature from Proverbs chapter 1 through 9, and it stands for the course of a person's life. Then we've got verses 15 through 18 stood out to me. In these verses, God blesses the righteous. In this verse 15, he blesses, his blessings take the form of an expanded land. And then in 16 through 18, God's people experience suffering similar to the excruciating pain of a woman in labor. Again, there's that image again that Isaiah uses multiple times of a woman in labor. A pregnant woman goes through that pain and receives a positive result, though, at the end, which is a baby. However, in this case, God's people just went through all this pain and they simply passed gas. Where it says gave birth to wind, right? There's passing gas. Ain't that what that is? But there was no deliverance and no victory over their enemies in this scenario here. And then, of course, chapter 27 starts out with the Leviathan, and it is slain. And I found this to be an interesting little blurb. But this is not the only place in the Bible that we see the Leviathan, and we talk about the Leviathan. And maybe we'll talk about it again in a different video, but I'm going to move on from here. And then, of course, the Lord's vineyard. This desirable vineyard is a metaphor for God's people. We are the vineyard. Each one of those grapes represents one of God's people in this story and this prophecy of Isaiah. Verse 13 at the end, the Israelites come back for the purpose of worship. The holy mountain refers to Zion and the location of the temple. So in the end, there's going to be a happy ending. We just got to get to that ending, right? No doubt. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button and the subscribe button. Of course, let's rumble it a little bit. Follow me on Rumble if you're on there. And of course, click the little notification button so you get notified the next time I upload a video, which will be tomorrow, for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.